August 31st, 1943. 23,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The air is thin and cold. 6 Grumman F6F Hellcats slice through scattered clouds in a loose fingertip formation. Their Pratt & Whitney engines hum with a deep, steady confidence. Below them, the Pacific stretches endless in blue. Above, the sky is empty. Then it isn't. The section leader spots them first, a formation of dark specks emerging from the sun's glare. He counts 9, maybe 10, Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. The fighter that has ruled these skies since Pearl Harbor. The aircraft that destroyed Wildcats and Buffaloes with brutal efficiency. The plane that turned American pilots into statistics. The Hellcat pilots push their throttles forward. The big Pratt & Whitney R2800s respond with power the Zeros cannot match. There is no hesitation in their movements. No fear in their spacing. They have trained for this moment in mock dogfights over California and Hawaii. They know their aircraft. They know what it can do. The Zeros begin their dive, expecting the same panicked break the Wildcats always made. But the Hellcats do not break. They do not scatter. They climb, impossibly powerfully, straight into the attack. What happens in the next 4 minutes will begin to rewrite the war in the Pacific. To understand why this moment matters, you must first understand what came before it. You must understand the weight of 2 years crushing down on every American pilot who climbed into a cockpit over the Pacific. You must understand the Zero, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns, and above the smoke, Zeros perform maneuvers American pilots have never seen. They turn tighter. They climb faster. They appear from nowhere and vanish into clouds before anyone can react. In the Philippines, on Wake Island, across Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, the story repeats. Allied fighters fall from the sky in flames. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero is not just superior, it is shockingly, devastatingly superior. The Zero was born from a specific philosophy. In the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy demanded the impossible, a carrier-based fighter with range, speed, climb rate, and maneuverability that exceeded anything flying. Mitsubishi's chief designer, Jiro Horikoshi, delivered by making a single ruthless choice. Weight. Everything that could be stripped away was stripped away. No armor plating behind the pilot's seat. No self-sealing fuel tanks. No redundant systems. The Zero was built from lightweight aluminum alloys, with a structure so delicate that maintenance crews learned to walk carefully on the wings. But it worked. The A6M could dogfight at altitudes where other fighters stalled. It could turn inside any opponent. Its 20mm cannons could shred enemy aircraft with short bursts. And its range, over 1,900 miles with drop tanks, allowed it to escort bombers deeper into enemy territory than anyone thought possible. When Zero pilots engaged Chinese aircraft over Chongqing in 1940, they established a kill ratio that seemed impossible. When they met British Hurricanes over Singapore, the result was the same. The Zero was not just good, it was revolutionary. Then came the American response, or rather the lack of one. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was a pre-war design, conceived when air combat meant something different. It was rugged, reliable, and hopelessly outmatched. Wildcat pilots learned this in blood. At the Coral Sea in May 1942, they learned that turning with a Zero was suicide. At Midway in June, they learned that the Zero could outclimb them at any altitude. Over Guadalcanal through late 1942 and early 1943, they learned that survival meant new tactics, the Thach Weave, the high-side boom and zoom, the desperate vertical scissors that might, if you were lucky, keep you alive long enough to escape. The statistics were grim. In the first year of the Pacific War, American fighter pilots faced kill ratios that ranged from barely even to catastrophically one-sided. The Wildcat could win fights, but only with superior numbers, superior tactics, or superior luck, often all three. Pilots who survived their first combat tour were considered veterans. Those who survived too were exceptional. The aircraft simply could not match the Zero's performance envelope. Behind the front lines, the losses accumulated into something worse than numbers. They accumulated into psychology. American pilots began each mission knowing their aircraft was inferior. They developed tactics based on avoiding the Zero's strengths rather than exploiting their own. They learned to respect the enemy not just as skilled pilots, but as men flying a machine that gave them every advantage. That kind of respect, born from repeated defeat, becomes difficult to shake. But in American factories and design bureaus, a different story was unfolding. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had been studying every combat report, every gun camera film, every pilot debrief. They knew what the Wildcat lacked. They knew what the Zero possessed. And by early 1942, they knew exactly what the Navy needed. The question was whether they could build it in time, whether they could produce it in numbers, and whether, when the moment came, it would actually work. Leroy Grumman understood something fundamental about naval aviation. Carrier pilots did not get second chances. They landed on pitching decks in storms. They fought hundreds of miles from home with no place to make emergency landings. They absorbed enemy fire and still had to find their way back to a moving ship in the dark. The aircraft that carried them needed to bring them home. This philosophy shaped every decision in the F4F Wildcat's design. When Grumman's engineers began work in early 1942, they had access to something invaluable, a captured Zero. In June 1942, an intact A6M had crash-landed in the Aleutians. American engineers disassembled it, studied it, test flew it, and learned its secrets. They measured its turn radius. They clocked its roll rate. They found its weaknesses. The Wildcat would not try to outturn the Zero. That was a fool's game, a trap that had killed too many Wildcat pilots. Instead, it would outpower it, outdive it, outclimb it, and outlast it. The design centered on the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. This was nearly double the Zero's sockeye engine output. The power difference was not incremental. It was transformational. But power meant nothing without survivability. The Wildcat carried armor plating behind the pilot's seat, thick steel that could stop 7.7-meter rounds and sometimes even 20-millimeter shells. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that swelled when punctured to stop leaks. Its airframe was robust, overbuilt by Zero standards, capable of absorbing battle damage that would tear a Zero apart. Grumman engineers designed it to take punishment and keep flying. Armament was equally decisive. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing with 400 rounds per gun. The 50 cal had proven itself in Europe and now in the Pacific, a devastating weapon with range, hitting power, and reliability. Concentrated fire from 6 guns could saw through a Zero's lightweight structure in seconds. Later models would carry rockets and bombs. But even in its basic fighter configuration, the Wildcat was a weapons platform that could destroy anything it could catch. The first prototype flew on June 26, 1942. Test pilots reported exactly what Grumman hoped: stable handling, excellent visibility from the cockpit, and power that felt limitless. The Navy ordered it into production immediately. By October 1942, the first production models rolled off the assembly line at Grumman's Bethpage, Long Island facility. By early 1943, new pilots were training on Wildcats in Florida and California. The production numbers tell their own story. Grumman's factories operated around the clock. Bethpage and a new facility in Trenton, New Jersey, employed thousands of workers, many of them women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war. By the end of 1943, they were producing Wildcats at a rate that Japanese industry could not even imagine matching. Where Mitsubishi might build a few dozen Zeros per month, Grumman built hundreds of Wildcats. American industrial capacity was not just superior, it was overwhelming. While assembly lines worked overtime in New Jersey, training pipelines expanded across the United States. New Navy pilots spent months learning their aircraft. They practiced gunnery until they could hit sleeves towed behind other planes. They flew mock dogfights until the Wildcat's handling became instinctive. They learned the tactics that would maximize their aircraft's strengths: maintain speed, use altitude, dive on the enemy, fire, and extend away using superior power. Never turn, never get slow, never give the Zero the fight it wanted. Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence officers received their first reports about the new American fighter. What they read did not concern them. The Wildcat was heavier than the Zero, clearly less maneuverable. It was larger, easier to spot and track. It relied on engine power rather than aerodynamic elegance, a brute force American approach that lacked sophistication. The reports circulated through Naval Air Headquarters. Some officers smiled. Some laughed. The Americans were building another Wildcat, just bigger, another target. This dismissal was not arrogance alone. It was based on experience. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had dominated every air combat engagement. Their training was superior, hundreds of hours before first combat, often including real combat experience in China. Their aircraft was superior. Their tactics, developed through years of warfare, were superior. Why should they fear another American attempt to catch up? But they were making a critical miscalculation. They were judging the Hellcat by zero standards, by zero philosophy. They believed that maneuverability was supreme, that the dogfight was the natural state of air combat, that the better-turning aircraft would always win. They did not understand that the Americans were no longer trying to win dogfights. They were trying to eliminate them entirely. By mid-1943, the first Hellcat squadrons were arriving in the Pacific. VF-5 received their aircraft in February. VF-9 transitioned in April. The pilots were young, most with no combat experience, but they had something the Wildcat pilots of 1942 never had, an aircraft that gave them an advantage. They were eager to prove it. The Japanese were equally eager to teach them the same lessons they had taught every other American fighter pilot. The stage was set. The Hellcat was ready, and in the vast blue arena of the Pacific, the Zero's long reign was about to face its first real challenge. Angle 1. The pilot's reality. Inside the cockpit, the difference was everything. An American pilot strapping into a Hellcat in mid-1943 sat behind a quarter-inch steel plate. He could feel its weight behind his back, a reassuring presence that might stop the bullets he would never see coming. His fuel tanks were wrapped in self-sealing rubber. His instrument panel was clearly laid out, logically arranged. The canopy gave him visibility in nearly every direction. When he pushed the throttle forward, the R-2800 engine responded with a roar that vibrated through the airframe. He had power. He had protection. He had a chance. A Japanese pilot climbing into a Zero felt something different. His seat had no armor. Behind him was thin aluminum and empty air. His fuel tanks were bare metal, one tracer round and they would ignite like a bomb. But he sat in one of the most responsive aircraft ever built. Every control input produced immediate results. The Zero felt alive, sensitive, eager. It could turn on a wingtip. It could float at speeds where other fighters fell from the sky. For a skilled pilot, it was an extension of his own body. But here was the crucial difference by 1943. The American pilots were getting better while the Japanese pilots were dying. The early Japanese aviators, the men who bombed Pearl Harbor, who flew over the Philippines and Malaya, had hundreds of hours of flight time and years of training. They were elite. By 1943, most of them were dead, shot down over Guadalcanal, killed at Midway, lost in the grinding attrition over New Guinea and the Solomons. Their replacements had less training, fewer hours, less experience. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not replace skilled pilots as fast as it was losing them. Meanwhile, American training programs were expanding massively. New pilots graduated from Pensacola with more flight hours than their 1942 predecessors. They learned not just how to fly, but how to fight. They studied combat reports. They practiced the boom and zoom. They learned to maintain situational awareness, to work in pairs, to use their radios effectively. When they arrived in the Pacific with their Hellcats, they were not raw recruits anymore. They were prepared. Angle 2, philosophy of design. The Zero and the Hellcat represented two completely different answers to the same question: what wins in air combat? The Japanese answer was elegance, minimalism, the perfect balance of agility and firepower, achieved by eliminating everything unnecessary. The Zero could outturn any Allied fighter at the war's start because it weighed thousands of pounds less. It sacrificed protection for performance, survivability for superiority in the dogfight. This was not a design flaw, it was a conscious choice, based on a belief that the superior pilot and the superior handling aircraft would always win. The American answer was pragmatism, power. The belief that if you could not outturn the enemy, you could outclimb him, outdive him, and outrun him. The Hellcat weighed 15,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly double the Zero's weight. But it had the engine to move that weight faster than the Zero could respond. It climbed at 3,500 feet per minute. It could dive at speeds that would tear a Zero's wings off. And when it absorbed damage, it kept flying. Wildcats had returned to carriers with holes you could put your fist through. Hellcats would do the same, but more often and with wounded pilots who survived because of the armor that saved them. The philosophical divide extended to weapons. The Zero carried two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, a mix that gave it both weight of fire and hitting power, but with limited ammunition for the cannons. Just 60 rounds per gun, a Zero pilot had to make every burst count. The Hellcat's 650 caliber Brownings carried 2,400 rounds total. An American pilot could afford to miss. He could walk his tracers onto target. He could fire longer bursts. The psychological advantage of abundant ammunition cannot be overstated. Angle 3. Tactical evolution. The Thach Weave saved American lives in 1942, but it was a defensive tactic. Two Wildcats flying together, scissoring back and forth, protecting each other's tails. It prevented the Zero from getting a clean shot, but it did not win fights. It survived them. The Hellcat allowed American tactics to become offensive. The new doctrine was simple: maintain altitude and speed advantages at all costs. Hellcat formations patrolled above expected enemy altitude. When they spotted Zeros, they dove from above, using gravity and engine power to build speed the Zeros could not match. They fired during the dive, high-deflection shooting that American gunnery training had prepared them for. Then they used their speed to extend away, climbing back to altitude using the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio at high speeds. The Zero pilot faced a terrible choice: try to follow the climb and stall out, or let the American escape to reset the engagement. This was not dogfighting. This was energy management. It was physics applied to air combat. The Hellcat pilots were taught to think in terms of energy states: potential energy from altitude, kinetic energy from speed. Never trade away your energy advantage. Never get slow. Never turn with a Zero. If the enemy is below you, you have the advantage. If he is above you, extend away and reset. It was methodical. It was disciplined. And against the Zero's traditional turning tactics, it was devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots, trained for years in close-in maneuvering combat, found themselves fighting an enemy who refused to fight the way they expected. The Americans would not turn. They would not slow down. They attacked like diving hawks and vanished before the Zero could bring its agility to bear. For pilots raised on the supremacy of the dogfight, this felt like cowardice. But it was not cowardice. It was evolution. Angle 4. The underestimation. In Tokyo, in Rabaul, in Truk, Japanese commanders reviewed intelligence reports about the F6F Hellcat with a confidence bordering on complacency. They had earned that confidence. Since 1941, every new American fighter had promised to challenge the Zero. The Buffalo had failed spectacularly. The Wildcat had proven marginally better but still inferior. The P-38 Lightning and P-39 Airacobra had shown flashes of capability but remained vulnerable in turning fights. Now came another American design, and the pattern seemed familiar. The numbers on paper did not impress them. Maximum speed, 380 miles per hour. Respectable but not revolutionary. Rate of climb, good but achieved through brute engine power rather than aerodynamic efficiency. Wing loading high, meaning slower turn rates. Weight, nearly 50% heavier than the Zero. To Japanese eyes, this looked like the American approach to every problem. Throw more metal, more power, more resources at it. Build it bigger and heavier and hope that compensates for inferior design. Some Japanese pilots who encountered early Hellcats in testing engagements reported back with dismissive assessments. The aircraft was fast in a straight line, they said, but clumsy in maneuvering. It could not sustain turns. It handled like a truck compared to the Zero's sports car responsiveness. These reports confirmed what commanders already believed. The Americans still did not understand air combat. They still thought they could win through industrial production rather than superior skill and design. This underestimation was rooted in genuine experience. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had been proven correct again and again. Their training methods worked. Their aircraft worked. Their tactics worked. Why should they fundamentally rethink their approach because the Americans built another heavy fighter? The institutional memory of victory created institutional blindness. They could not see that the Americans had stopped trying to build a better Zero. They were building something designed specifically to kill Zeros without ever fighting, the way Zeros fought. There was laughter in some ready rooms when the Hellcats' specifications were posted, laughter based on the assumption that air combat was still about dogfighting, still about turn radius and roll rate. The Japanese had not yet grasped that the Americans had changed the rules of the game entirely. Angle 5. Industrial Realities. While Japanese commanders laughed, American factories were winning a different kind of war. Grumman's production lines operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts cycling through. At peak production in 1944, they completed a new Hellcat every hour. The Bethpage plant alone employed over 25,000 workers. Women who had been teachers and secretaries and homemakers now riveted airframes and installed hydraulic systems and wired instrument panels. The production system was ruthlessly efficient, breaking construction into specialized tasks that could be learned quickly and performed repeatedly with precision. Mitsubishi's Zero production could not match this scale. Japanese industry operated under severe resource constraints. Aluminum was scarce. Skilled labor was limited. The production process remained more artisanal, experienced craftsmen building aircraft with techniques that did not translate easily to mass production. By 1943, Japan was producing perhaps 800 to 1,000 Zeros per year. In the same period, Grumman would build over 6,000 Hellcats. The mathematics of attrition were brutal. Even if Japanese and American pilots were equally skilled, even if kill ratios remained even, the Americans could afford losses that Japan could not. Every Hellcat shot down could be replaced within days. Every pilot killed could be replaced by another from the expanding training pipeline. Japan's reserves were finite and shrinking. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every Zero destroyed represented aluminum and labor that was desperately needed elsewhere. This industrial disparity meant something profound. American pilots could be aggressive. They could take risks. They could press attacks knowing that if they were shot down, another pilot in another Hellcat would take their place tomorrow. Japanese pilots increasingly had to be conservative to preserve their dwindling numbers. A defensive mindset was creeping into a force that had once been defined by offensive aggression. Angle 6. What they faced. Strip away the statistics and the strategy, and what remains is simpler and more terrible. Young men, most barely into their 20s, climbing into machines designed to kill and be killed in. An American Hellcat pilot starting his engine on a carrier deck knew that in the next few hours, he might burn alive in his cockpit or drown when his damaged aircraft hit the water, or simply vanish into the Pacific with no one ever knowing what happened. The armor behind his seat was reassuring until he remembered it only protected from behind. A head-on attack could still kill him instantly. A Japanese Zero pilot faced even grimmer odds. No armor meant every hit could be fatal. The unprotected fuel tanks meant that a single tracer could turn his aircraft into a fireball. Japanese pilots developed superstitions, lucky scarves, particular rituals before takeoff, prayers to ancestors. They wrote letters home knowing they might never return. The code of Bushido demanded they fight to the death, that surrender was unthinkable, that to die in combat was honorable. This was not mere propaganda. Many genuinely believed it. That belief made them dangerous, but it also made them vulnerable to an enemy who had no cultural prohibition against retreat and reset. Both sides trained their pilots to kill efficiently. Gun camera footage from both American and Japanese aircraft shows the same cold reality. Aircraft coming apart under sustained fire, pieces flying off, smoke trails, the final tumbling descent. Behind every confirmed kill was a human being who left behind family, friends, unfulfilled dreams. The Hellcat made American pilots more likely to be the ones who survived these encounters. That was its purpose. That was its success. But success in air combat is measured in deaths, and the humanity of those deaths does not change regardless of which side you flew for. By late 1943, the pieces were all in place. The Hellcat was deployed in numbers. American pilots were trained and ready. Japanese forces still held significant territory but were increasingly stretched thin. The stage was set not for a single decisive battle, but for a systematic reversal of everything that had been true about Pacific air combat since Pearl Harbor. The laughter was about to stop. September 1st, 1943. Marcus Island. The first real test arrives not with fanfare but with the routine brutality of a carrier strike. Task Force 15, built around the carriers USS Essex, Yorktown, and Independence, launches pre-dawn raids against Japanese installations. The Hellcat squadrons are mixed in with Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers. VF-9 and VF-5 flying F6 F3 models provide the fighter escort and sweep. The Japanese scramble Zeros from the island's airstrip, approximately 15 aircraft claw for altitude. They expect what they have always encountered, cautious American fighters that can be drawn into turning fights. What they meet instead is different. The Hellcats maintain formation discipline. They do not chase individual targets. They approach with altitude advantage and execute coordinated diving attacks. Lieutenant Commander John L. Jimmy Flatley leads VF-5. He has flown Wildcats at the Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. He knows what losing feels like. Now he rolls his Hellcat into a steep dive, building speed past 400 miles per hour. His wingman stays with him. They converge on a Zero climbing to intercept the bombers. Flatley opens fire at 300 yards. 650 caliber streams converge. The Zero's wing root explodes. The aircraft snaps into an uncontrolled roll and plummets. Flatley does not watch it fall. He is already extending away, climbing back to altitude using power the Zero cannot match. Above him, another element engages. Ensign Robert Duncan catches a Zero in a gentle turn. The Japanese pilot sees him coming and tightens his turn, the instinctive response that has worked for 2 years. But Duncan does not follow the turn. He dives beneath, uses his speed to zoom back up on the opposite side and catches the Zero in a moment of vulnerability. 2-second burst. The Zero's fuel tank ignites. The aircraft becomes a torch falling toward the ocean. The engagement lasts 11 minutes. When it ends, VF-5 and VF-9 report 9 Zeros destroyed for the loss of 1 Hellcat, a pilot who pushed his dive too aggressively and could not pull out in time. The kill ratio is 9-1. The strike aircraft complete their mission and return safely. In the ready rooms afterward, there is cautious optimism. Maybe the Hellcat is what they were promised. November 1943. Tarawa. The Marines are dying on the beaches, and the Navy's carriers provide air support. The Hellcat squadrons fly multiple sorties daily: combat air patrol, ground attack, intercepts. Japanese aircraft from nearby bases attempt to strike the invasion fleet. They are met by standing patrols of Hellcats stacked at different altitudes. On November 20th, a formation of 18 Zeros and 9 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers attempts a dusk attack on the carriers. The Hellcats of VF-1 flying from USS Yorktown intercept them 30 miles out. The engagement is one-sided. The Zeros, burdened with escorting the slower bombers, cannot maintain the energy advantage they need. The Hellcats dive through the formation repeatedly. The 50 caliber fire is devastating. 4 bombers go down in the first pass. 6 Zeros are destroyed trying to protect them. 1 Zero pilot, experienced, possibly a veteran of Pearl Harbor or Midway based on his aggressive maneuvering, manages to get onto the tail of a Hellcat. He closes to firing range. His 20mm cannons hit the Hellcat's tail and fuselage. The American aircraft shudders. Metal tears. But the pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrashu, feels the controls still respond. The armor has held. The fuel tanks are not burning. He pushes his throttle to the firewall and dives. The Zero follows, but Vrashu's Hellcat pulls away. At 450 miles per hour, the Zero simply cannot keep up. Vrashu extends 3 miles, pulls up in a climbing chandelle, and comes back around. Now he has the altitude. Now he has the speed. The Zero is slow and vulnerable. Vrashu's burst strikes the engine cowling. The Zero trails smoke, then fire, then falls. Vrashu lands back on Yorktown with 37 holes in his aircraft. Maintenance crews count them, photograph them, and patch them. The Hellcat flies again the next day. That durability, that ability to take punishment and survive, becomes a story that spreads through the fleet. Pilots trust their aircraft more. They press attacks more aggressively. Confidence builds. By December 1943, the pattern is unmistakable. Wherever Hellcats engage Zeros, the kill ratios favor the Americans dramatically. But individual engagements are scattered. They involve small numbers. The Japanese high command can dismiss them as anomalies, as the result of superior American numbers or fortunate circumstances. What cannot be dismissed is a battle so large, so definitive, that its outcome cannot be explained away. That battle is coming. January 1944. Rabaul. The massive Japanese base on New Britain has been a thorn in Allied operations for months. Its airfields host hundreds of aircraft, Zeros, bombers, reconnaissance planes. The Allies decide on systematic destruction. Operation Cartwheel includes repeated carrier strikes designed to eliminate Japanese air power in the region. The Hellcat squadrons get their chance to operate in large-scale combat. On January 17th, carriers Bunker Hill and Monterey launch a strike of over 100 aircraft. The fighter escort includes 36 Hellcats from VF-17 and VF-18. Japanese radar picks up the incoming formation. Rabaul scrambles everything available. Estimates suggest 60 to 70 Zeros rising to meet the attack. The engagement begins at 14,000 feet. The Hellcats are higher, at 18,000 feet. They see the Zeros below, climbing in formations of 3 and 4. The American squadron leaders give simple orders. Attack from above, maintain speed, do not get drawn into turning fights. The Hellcats roll over and dive. The Japanese see them coming. They expect the Americans to pull out of the dives and engage in close combat. Some Zero pilots turn to face the attack, preparing to use their superior agility. But the Hellcats do not pull out level. They dive through the Japanese formations, firing as they pass, and continue diving to build even more speed. Zeros explode. Others spin out of control. The ones that try to follow the dives cannot keep up. The Hellcats extend away to low altitude, then use their power to climb back above the engagement. It happens again and again. Each pass takes down more Zeros. The Japanese pilots are brave and skilled, but they are fighting an engagement their training never prepared them for. They cannot force the turning fight. They cannot catch the Americans. Every time they try to reset and climb, the Hellcats dive on them again from an angle they did not anticipate. The fighting over Rabaul continues for 23 minutes. Individual duels scatter across 40 miles of sky. One Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Ira Kepford of VF-17, accounts for 4 Zeros in a single engagement. He dives on a formation of 3, destroys the leader with a deflection shot, extends away, climbs, and comes back on the wingmen who are still searching for him. 2 more burst into flames. The 4th he catches trying to dive away. The Zeros one desperate attempt to escape using the same tactic the Americans employ. But the Hellcat dives faster. Kepford closes to 200 yards and fires. The Zero disintegrates. Another pilot, Ensign James Swope, finds himself alone after his section becomes separated. He spots 6 Zeros below him in a Loughbury circle, a defensive formation where each aircraft covers the tail of the one ahead. It should be impenetrable. Swope dives from directly above straight down through the center of the circle. He fires at the closest Zero as he passes, hits. Possibly a kill, but he does not stay to confirm. He is through the formation and diving away before the other 5 can react. By the time they break the circle to pursue, he is 2 miles away and climbing. They cannot catch him. The engagement ends when the Zeros run low on fuel and ammunition. They break off and scatter back to Rabaul's airfields. The Hellcats reform, rejoin the strike package, and escort the bombers home. The after-action reports list 24 confirmed Zero kills and another 8 probables. 3 Hellcats are lost. 1 to a lucky 20mm hit that severed a hydraulic line, causing the pilot to crash on landing. 2 others simply vanish, possibly mid-air collisions in the chaos or structural failures in the violent maneuvering, but the ratio is 8 to 1. The Japanese have lost nearly a quarter of the aircraft they scrambled. Word spreads through the Pacific Fleet. The Hellcat is not just adequate, it is dominant. But Rabaul is still not the definitive moment. The Japanese can claim their pilots were outnumbered, that the Americans had surprised, that conditions favored the attackers. They can tell themselves that in a fair fight the Zero would still prevail. Spring 1944. The Philippines truck the Marianas. The American advance continues. Hellcat squadrons are now standard across the fleet. Every carrier strike begins with F6F sweeps to clear the skies. The kill ratios remain consistent. 8 to 1, 10 to 1, sometimes higher. But Japanese defenses stiffen as the war approaches their inner defensive perimeter. The Imperial Japanese Navy commits its remaining carrier forces to stopping the American advance. This sets the stage for the largest carrier battle in history. June 19, 1944, the WWII, Philippine Sea. Operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, has drawn out the Japanese mobile fleet. Vice Admiral Jusaburo Ozawa commands 9 carriers with 473 aircraft. Against him, Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 58 fields 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft. More than 475 of those are Hellcats. The Japanese plan is bold. Launch strikes from maximum range, attack the American fleet, and land at Guam's airfields to refuel before returning. use the island bases as a shuttle to extend their operational range. The Americans detect the Japanese fleet at dawn. Spruance orders combat air patrols increased. By 10 a.m., nearly 300 Hellcats are airborne in layered defensive screens, some at 10,000 feet, others at 15,000, others at 20,000. They orbit in groups of 4 and 8, waiting. At 10:23 a.m., radar picks up the first Japanese strike. 69 aircraft inbound, Zeros, Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers. The fighter director officers vector Hellcat sections toward the intercept. The pilots hear the orders crackling over the radio. Vector 265, bogies at 50 miles, Angels 12. Angels 12 means 12,000 feet. The Hellcats climb to 18,000. They make contact at 10:36 a.m. The Japanese formation is spread out, struggling to maintain cohesion. The Zeros are supposed to be out front providing cover, but they have drifted back into the bomber formations. The Hellcats hit them from above and ahead. VF-15 from USS Essex takes the first pass. 12 Hellcats dive through the formation. 6 Zeros go down in the first 30 seconds. The Japanese bombers scatter. Their tight formations dissolve into individual aircraft trying to survive. More Hellcat sections arrive. VF-2 from Hornet, VF-16 from Lexington. They attack in coordinated groups, slashing through the Japanese formations, firing, extending, climbing, and attacking again. The Japanese pilots try to fight back, but they are overwhelmed. Some Zeros attempt a dogfight and are immediately pounced on by other Hellcats diving from above. Others try to protect the bombers and are shot down in the attempt. A few manage to get through the defensive screen, but they are so reduced in number that the anti-aircraft fire from the fleet destroys most of them. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsu, the same pilot who survived the hit over Tarawa, is vectored toward a group of Judy dive bombers that broke through the first line of defense. He finds them at 12,000 feet, diving toward the carriers. He positions himself above and behind. Then he dives, building speed, closing the distance. He lines up on the trailing Judy, fires, explosion, the bomber breaks apart. He shifts aim to the next, fires, another explosion. He works his way up the formation methodically, like a farmer reaping wheat. 6 Judys fall to his guns in a span of 8 minutes. When he lands back on Lexington, his gun barrels are so hot they glow faintly. His hands are shaking from adrenaline. He has just become an ace in a single engagement. The first Japanese strike is annihilated. Of the 69 aircraft launched, only 27 return to their carriers. The Zeros sent to protect the bombers are nearly wiped out. Perhaps 30 launched. Fewer than 10 survive. The Japanese launch a second strike. Then a third. Then a fourth. Each meets the same reception. Hellcats stacked at altitude, directed by radar, attacking with coordinated aggression. The engagement spreads across hundreds of square miles. Individual dogfights occur at every altitude from sea level to 25,000 feet. But the outcome is never in doubt. The Hellcats own the sky. By 3 p.m., the slaughter is complete. Japanese losses are catastrophic. Estimates vary, but the most reliable counts suggest 243 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air. Another 50 damaged beyond repair or lost attempting to land at Guam. Against this, the Americans lose 29 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire or operational accidents, not enemy fighters. Of those 29, several pilots are recovered. The aviators aboard the American carriers will later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name is flippant, almost cruel, but it captures the one-sided nature of the battle. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Japanese carrier air power, the force that struck Pearl Harbor, that sank the Prince of Wales and Repulse, that dominated the Pacific skies for 2 years, was effectively destroyed in a single day. Among the wreckage, falling into the Philippine Sea are over 100 Zeros, the fighter that Japanese commanders had laughed about facing, the aircraft they believed could never challenge their supremacy. The Hellcat had proven them catastrophically wrong, and the Japanese commanders reading the after-action reports from their surviving pilots were no longer laughing. The numbers compiled in the weeks following the Philippine Sea battle tell a story that Japanese naval aviation will never recover from. Of the 473 carrier aircraft the mobile fleet launched that morning, 395 do not return. The aircrew losses are even more devastating. Experienced pilots who survived Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and Coral Sea are gone. Squadron leaders with years of training and combat experience are dead, The Japanese carrier force still has ships, though two carriers, Shokaku and Taiho, were sunk by American submarines during the battle. But the ships are hollow shells without trained aviators to fly from their decks. The Imperial Japanese Navy attempts to rebuild. New pilots are rushed through abbreviated training programs. Men who would have spent 2 years learning their craft in 1941 now receive 6 months, then 4 months, then sometimes only weeks of basic flight instruction before being assigned to operational units. They arrive at their squadrons barely able to perform carrier landings, with minimal gunnery training and no combat experience. They are sent to fight American pilots who have hundreds of hours in Hellcats and multiple combat tours behind them. The kill ratios reflect this disparity. In battles after June 1944, American Hellcat squadrons routinely achieve ratios of 15-1, 20-1, sometimes higher. Individual aces run their scores into the 20s and 30s. Commander David McCampbell, flying from USS Essex, will end the war with 34 confirmed kills, all against Japanese aircraft, most of them while flying the Hellcat. In a single engagement on October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell shoots down 9 Japanese aircraft before his ammunition runs out. His wingman accounts for 6 more. The Japanese formations they intercept are destroyed almost completely. The Hellcat's final tally, calculated after the war ends, is staggering. 5,123 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. This represents approximately 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. The overall kill ratio settles at 19-1. For every Hellcat lost in air combat, 19 enemy aircraft were destroyed. No other fighter aircraft in history achieves a ratio this dominant over such a large sample size. But statistics cannot capture what this meant strategically. Air superiority, complete uncontested control of the skies, allowed every subsequent American operation in the Pacific to proceed without effective Japanese air opposition. The island-hopping campaign accelerates. Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each invasion begins with days of carrier strikes that destroy Japanese air assets on the ground and in the air. The kamikazes, Japan's desperate response in 1945, are suicide attacks precisely because conventional air combat has become hopeless. Japanese pilots know they cannot win dogfights with Hellcats, so they turn their aircraft into guided bombs, hoping to damage American ships before they are shot down. The Hellcat squadrons adapt to this new threat. Combat air patrols increase in size and duration. Hellcats orbit the fleet in layers, vectored by radar to intercept kamikazes before they reach the ships. It is grim work. The Japanese pilots do not maneuver defensively. They point their aircraft at carriers and fly straight, accepting death as certain. The Hellcats shoot them down by the hundreds. Gun camera footage from this period shows Zeros, Judys, and Vals coming apart under 50 caliber fire, trailing flames, crashing into the sea. Some get through. Ships burn, sailors die, but the Hellcats prevent what could have been catastrophic losses. On the Japanese side, the psychological impact is profound. Pilots who survive encounters with Hellcats return with reports that sound like trauma rather than tactical assessments. They describe being attacked from angles they never saw, being chased down in dives they thought would save them, watching wingmen explode without knowing where the fire came from. The Zero, once a symbol of Japanese air power and technical superiority, becomes a coffin. Pilots assigned to Zero squadrons write farewell letters before missions. They do not expect to return. Japanese commanders issue new tactical directives attempting to counter the Hellcat. Zeros are ordered to attack only when they have altitude advantage, to avoid diving attacks, to stay in pairs and cover each other, to retreat if the Americans have superior position. These are sensible tactics, but they represent a fundamental admission. The Zero can no longer dominate. It can only attempt to survive. The psychology of air combat has reversed completely. Production attempts cannot close the gap. By 1945, Japan is building new fighter designs, the Kawanishi N1K Shiden, the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, aircraft that on paper match or exceed the Hellcat's performance. But they arrive in tiny numbers, plagued by production difficulties, material shortages, and lack of trained pilots to fly them. Meanwhile, Grumman's factories continue producing Hellcats at full capacity. By war's end, 12,275 Hellcats have been built. They equip nearly every carrier in the Pacific Fleet. They serve with Marine Corps squadrons on island bases. The British Fleet Air Arm flies them in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. The aircraft that Japanese commanders once laughed at has become ubiquitous. The human cost accumulates beyond what any statistic can convey. In the 18 months following the Marianas turkey shoot, thousands of Japanese aviators die. Many are teenagers, 17, 18 years old, pulled from technical schools and given rudimentary flight training before being sent into combat. They face American pilots with 2 years of experience flying an aircraft superior in nearly every performance category. The outcome is predetermined. These young men climb into their Zeros knowing the odds. Many never make it through their first mission. Their bodies are never recovered from the Pacific. Their families receive telegrams informing them of deaths that occurred in battles whose names they will never learn. American losses, though dramatically lower, are no less final for the families who receive them. A Hellcat pilot shot down 400 miles from his carrier drowns or dies of exposure, just as surely as if he had been flying an inferior aircraft. The armor and durability that save many pilots cannot save all of them. Some take direct hits to the cockpit. Some suffer mechanical failures and ditch in heavy seas. Some are captured and executed by Japanese forces. The 270 Hellcats lost in air combat represent 270 young men, most in their 20s, who left home believing in the cause and never returned. Their superiority in equipment and training gave them better odds, but it did not make them invulnerable. The strategic consequences ripple outward. With air superiority established, American forces move closer to Japan itself. By early 1945, B-29 superfortresses are conducting strategic bombing raids on Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo in March kills an estimated 100,000 civilians. The raids on other cities, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, add tens of thousands more. The Hellcats' dominance made these raids possible by eliminating the Japanese fighter threat. The moral weight of this is complex. Air superiority was militarily necessary. It saved American lives by shortening the war, but it also enabled destruction on a scale that remains difficult to fully process. Japan attempts late-war adaptations that reveal desperation. The Shiden and Raiden fighters show flashes of capability when flown by surviving veteran pilots, but there are too few of both the aircraft and the pilots. The suicide tactics expand beyond kamikazes to include Oka rocket-powered flying bombs and explosive-laden speedboats. These are not innovations born of strength. They are the tactics of a nation that has lost the conventional military contest and knows it. The Hellcat pilots who shoot down kamikazes feel no satisfaction in it. There is no honor in killing men who cannot defend themselves, but there is necessity. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. In the silence that follows, Hellcat pilots on carrier decks hear the news over loudspeakers. Some cheer. Others sit quietly, trying to process what it means that they will not die tomorrow. The war is over, but the aircraft continue flying. Hellcats patrol over Tokyo Bay as the surrender is signed aboard USS Missouri on September 2nd. They escort transport aircraft bringing occupation forces into Japan. They fly over islands that only months earlier were defended by Zeros they would have shot down. The post-war assessments begin immediately. American military analysts study the Hellcats' performance to extract lessons for future aircraft design. The conclusions are clear. Durability matters more than raw maneuverability. Pilot protection saves lives and maintains morale. Engine power creates tactical flexibility. Ease of production ensures numerical superiority. These principles inform the next generation of American fighters. The F-8F Bearcat, the F-9F Panther, eventually the jets that will dominate Korea and Vietnam. Japanese analysts conduct their own reviews, though the context is far different. They are analyzing not how to improve but how they lost. The Zero's design philosophy, its elegant minimalism, is identified as fundamentally flawed for sustained warfare. An aircraft that cannot protect its pilot cannot sustain an experienced pilot corps. An aircraft that cannot be mass-produced cannot win a war of attrition. The lessons are learned too late to matter for this war, but they shape Japan's post-war aviation industry. When Japan begins building military aircraft again in the 1950s, they emphasize durability and pilot survivability. The Hellcat itself remains in service for several years after the war. The U.S. Navy uses them for training and reserve squadrons. France uses them in Indochina. They fly in minor conflicts and brush wars before being gradually replaced by jet aircraft. The last combat mission flown by a Hellcat occurs in 1954. Then they are retired, sent to scrapyards, or preserved in museums. A few still fly today at air shows maintained by collectors and enthusiasts who understand what the aircraft represented. The pilots scatter into civilian life. Some continue flying, commercial aviation, crop dusting, flight instruction. Others leave aviation entirely, trading the sky for ordinary jobs in ordinary towns. They carry their experiences in silence mostly. Veterans understand what happened in the Pacific skies. Civilians cannot. How do you explain to someone who has never been in combat what it feels like to kill another pilot? How do you describe the moment when a Zero explodes in your gun sight and you know you have just ended someone's life? Most do not try. They return to their families, to normalcy, and they let the memories settle like sediment. Japanese survivors face a different reintegration. Japan is occupied, devastated, struggling to feed its population. Former Zero pilots return to cities that have been burned to rubble. Some are received as defeated veterans of a disgraced military. Others are honored quietly by families who understand they did their duty in impossible circumstances. They do not speak of what they saw, the friends who died, the battles they lost, the years spent fighting in an aircraft that became obsolete before their eyes. The silence is cultural and necessary. The war must be left behind so the country can rebuild. But history does not forget. Decades later, when historians compile the records and veterans finally begin sharing their stories, the Hellcat's role becomes clearer. It was not just a good aircraft. It was the right aircraft at the right time, flown by well-trained pilots supported by overwhelming industrial capacity. It represented the moment when American military production and tactical adaptation surpassed Japanese innovation and experience. The commanders who laughed at its specifications learned too late that they had misjudged not just an aircraft, but an entire approach to warfare. The 100 Zeros that fell were not the end. They were the beginning of the end. They were the proof that the tide had turned, that Japanese air power would not recover, that the path forward led only to defeat. In ready rooms across the Japanese-held Pacific, pilots who heard the report stopped laughing. They understood what was coming. And in the months that followed, as the Hellcats came in waves, they learned the true cost of underestimation. Wars are decided by men, but shaped by the tools they wield. The Hellcat was such a tool, not elegant, not revolutionary in concept, but devastating in its practical effectiveness. It succeeded because it was designed around a clear understanding of what actually wins in combat. Not the most graceful aircraft, but the one that brings its pilot home alive while completing the mission. The laughter of Japanese commanders in 1943 was not born of stupidity. It came from genuine experience, from years of validated success. But experience can become a trap when it hardens into assumption. They assumed air combat would remain what it had always been, close-in maneuvering duels where the best-turning aircraft prevailed. They did not see that the Americans had stopped playing by those rules. The Hellcat was designed to win fights the Zero never wanted, fights at high speed, at altitude, with energy management replacing acrobatics. It was an answer to a question the Japanese never asked. There is something sobering in how completely the tide turned. The Zero that terrorized Allied airmen in 1941 became prey by 1944. The pilots who flew it, brave, skilled, dedicated, died in staggering numbers not because they lacked courage but because they lacked the tools and training to compete. Warfare has always been this way, unforgiving, brutally objective, indifferent to valor when matched against superior systems. The Hellcat's legacy is more than numbers, though the numbers are impressive. It represents a lesson about adaptation, about learning from failure, about translating industrial capacity into tactical advantage, about refusing to fight the enemy's fight. The Americans in 1942 were losing. By 1944, they were dominant. The Hellcat was a central piece of that transformation. In museums now, the few surviving Hellcats sit silent beside restored Zeros. Visitors photograph them, read the placards, and move on. But if you look closely, at the thick armor plate behind the pilot's seat, at the robust engine cowling, at the gun ports for 650 calibers, you can still see the philosophy encoded in metal. This aircraft was built to win a specific war against a specific enemy. It succeeded absolutely. The men who flew it came home in numbers their predecessors could not have imagined. The men who faced it fell from Pacific skies in their hundreds and thousands. That is the true measure of any weapon, not its grace, but its terrible efficiency. The Hellcat was efficient, and in the calculus of war, efficiency is measured in lives, both those saved and those ended. The laughter stopped when the shooting started. By the time the war ended, there was nothing left to laugh about at all.